Today we're going to finish out chapter 4 by digging a little bit deeper into pop culture and to folk culture and to continue with the challenges that they face. Going to get into sustainability a little bit and look at how, for example, in folk culture, the challenges that they have in this age of globalization as affected by pop culture taking over the world is a challenge that folk culture has to endure. For popular culture, there's challenges there too with a lack of sustainability in practices and how it's designed to promote and provide for uniform landscapes. It's tough, for it to survive. And those are the things that we're going to talk about today. As you're looking at the front slide, you can see that we have images of The Simpsons, we have images of the Amish, we have an image of the Masters golf course, we have monks with cell phones in their hands. So you can see the variety that we're going to talk about today as we try to answer this question of why do cultures face sustainability challenges. The first thing that we got to talk about is how hard it is to maintain a unique folk culture. Pop culture is global because of communications. People all over the world are now connected to pop culture that is driven by Western countries all over the world. Folk culture is struggling. It faces a huge challenge, and one, because of the Western perspectives dominating the world with pop culture, but another reason is because of rising incomes, all right? People that are within isolated areas around the world that try to adhere to folk culture are kind of driven to the idea of making more money and other things that we'll talk about. Now, a great example of trying to maintain a unique folk culture are the Amish, all right, and Amish migration and preserving their cultural identity. Now, the Amish are a group that started coming to the United States in the 1700s. There were two waves. First, there was a wave from Switzerland and Germany, and then there was a second wave from France and so on. These folks settled mainly in Pennsylvania. They try to preserve their cultural identity while they've been here in the United States. They still use horse and buggy. They still use hand tools. And if the true Amish do not use electricity on their farms or in their areas around Pennsylvania, and then we'll talk about where they've diffused to all over the United States, basically. Now, there's 500,000 Amish folk that live in 19 states. They started coming here, like I said, in the 1700s, okay? So these are the groups of people that we're talking about. So if there had to be a capital of the Amish here in the United States, it would be in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where there's about 37,000 people that live currently in Lancaster County. That second wave moved to Ohio and Iowa and Illinois. And this map that you see in front of you does a real good job of showing you the diffusion and the distribution of Amish people here in the United States. All right, so you can see that there's 19 states where these folks live. Now, the movement or the diffusion of Amish people has increased recently, not recently, but over the last 20 to 30 years because of land. In Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, the metropolitan areas are starting to move into Amish country, and the price of land is going up. So the folks that are living in Lancaster County are having to move. They're moving to Kentucky, they're moving to Ohio, and they're moving away from the areas where the land is very expensive. Also, I've been to Lancaster County. I've been to see the Amish. I was a tourist. The true Amish that are trying to preserve their cultural identity are getting very annoyed by the amount of tourists that are coming to their area. So they're moving to areas that have cheaper land and are not as well known as Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the capital of the Amish world here in the United States, and so on. So that's how they're trying to maintain this unique folk culture. Now, another way that cultural values are challenged have to do with marriage in India. Now, we've been to India already in this class. We talked about, in our documentary, It's a Girl. We've seen the problems that they have with family planning and so on. Well, there's definitely problems with over the years in India's history dealing with marriage, okay? So in India, the traditional jobs of women are absolutely being challenged because women are wanting to work outside the home. Now, one thing that's happening here is there's a movement of popular customs that have impacted women. And one thing that really we're going to focus on here is marriage. Now, in order to talk about marriage in India, we have to first talk about something called a dowry. Now, a dowry is a gift that was given from one family to another. Okay, it's a gift from one family to another when an Indian man and woman were going to get married. Now, traditionally and over the years, the groom had to give a gift to the bride's family, okay? Traditionally, it was the groom's job to give gifts or a gift to the bride's family. Starting in the 20th century, it changed in India. And now the bride and the bride's family had to give this gift to a groom. Now, it can be cash, it can be goods, it can be cars, it can be electronics and different things like that. If the bride's family is unable to pay, the groom's family is going to cash the bride out on the street. All right. This has caused a lot of violence that we'll look at after we give this lesson today when we look at an article that's talking about the violence. And that violence has led to deaths recently when the bride did not pay the dowry to the groom. Okay, this has become a big problem. In 1961, India instituted the anti-dowry laws, which banned dowries. Since then, it is illegal to have dowries in India. But we know India doesn't really listen to the government that much. And in many places around India, the idea of the dowry tradition is still around. So basically, since 1961, this anti-dowry law in India has largely been ignored by people. The bride's gift to the groom has become much larger now. And in fact, grooms have counted on this dowry as a source of their income, okay? So it really has become a problem, and it has become a violent problem, all right, which is a challenge to this cultural value and so on that the people of India have. The dowry system. We'll go ahead and we'll read that after we get done with this lesson. Now, the future of folk culture is pretty bleak, all right, because of many reasons, all right? First off, folk culture is totally, as we've talked about many times, being influenced by the outside world. People are starting to move away from isolated areas for better economic opportunities. They want less expensive stuff. They want better homes and so on. The diffusion of people are looking to improve their income. They see and they read, because of mass communications and availability of the internet, how other people in other areas are succeeding, how there's a better income and so on. And living in isolated areas is not it's frowned upon these days. And when you move away from the isolated area, those folk cultures in these isolated areas and traditions are going to the wayside. Now, these folks are reading and they're learning about better housing. They're learning about simple things like better clothing, better clothes to wear in areas and so on. So these isolated areas are being moved away from, and with that, the folk culture is losing it as well. So there's this huge rift around the world, and people are wanting to preserve the diversity. They want to preserve the vibrancy of folk culture. Now, at the beginning of the slide, you saw that there are monks there, traditional monks that have iPads in their hands, that have iPhones in their hand, okay? So the future of folk culture is very bleak, and any chance that countries have the ability to continue these folk cultural traditions, they really need to and so on, because they are the traditions of our past that most of these places were formed upon. Now, the next term that we're going to talk about, continuing with our lesson, is called cultural convergence. You were actually asked to define this when you went into one of your earlier activities in this chapter. And just to review, this is a theory that two cultures will start to reflect each other the more that they interact, okay? So as more cultures are moving around the world, the fusion of these cultures are moving around the world, some of them are colliding. And when these cultures are colliding, they tend to interact. And what happens is this something called cultural convergence. Now, a word associated with cultural convergence is cultural homogenization. And you can see the prefix there in the word, which kind of gives you an idea about what it's going to be about. Now, cultural homogenization means that it's when pop culture spreads across large areas that results in a loss of folk culture and convergence, a joining together of these things, okay? Now, one result, actually, there's a few results of this. There can be definitely an impact on the environment, which is part of our sustainability question that we need to answer today, and culture. When this cultural homogenization happens and when pop culture is spread around large areas, number one, a negative impact on the environment is a pollution of it. It can definitely adversely impact the environmental quality. So pollution of the landscape is something that's an effect of this spread of culture. Depletion of resources, when you have more people coming to an area, escaping traditionally isolated areas, you can have a quick depletion of resources. And environmental quality is not the only thing that is affected by this. Cultural diversity is affected by this. You can have a large crowding of locally owned businesses when people are moving away from isolated areas into these areas that they've been drawn to through pop culture. Now, the Western countries of our world, the Western countries, meaning the United States, meaning France, meaning Britain, the bigger countries in our world, are the worst at this, are the worst at cultural homogenization and so on. Western countries have been very successful at sending pop culture all over the world. In fact, there's a term that relates to that, and it's called cultural imperialization, how Western countries are basically taking over the pop culture world and spreading these new ideas to people all over the world. Now, the next thing we'll talk about is basically uniform cultural experience, and it gives you a good idea and examples of how this is happening. Well, the best example that I can give you of uniform cultural experience has to do with fast food franchises. All right, it's a great example of uniformity. Now, basically what a franchise is, it's an agreement between a corporation and business people to market that corporation's products in a local area, okay? When you sign on to have a franchise of one of these fast food restaurants like McDonald's or Kentucky Fried Chicken or Pizza Hut and so on, there's an agreement that you sign, and it allows for you as a local owner to use that company's name, all of its symbols, all of its trademarks, all of its architecture, and so on, and so on. The success of these fast food restaurants basically has to do with them being very recognizable. If I drew the McDonald's arches right here, probably every person in every continent on the world recognizes that, all right, because of this recognition and so on. So Starbucks, McDonald's, Wendy's, Taco Bell is a great example of these uniform cultural experiences. Now, it's not just in fast food franchises too, where there's this certain uniformity around the world. Here's a Hilton in Africa that you can see that does the same thing. All right, so it's not just fast food franchises that is a great example of this uniformity, this concept of pop culture and uniformity flowing all over the world. We have fast food franchises, we have hotel franchises all over the world, and any other kind of franchise that you can think about. Okay, now let's talk about golf. In our last section there, it talks about how golf can be a great example of how pop culture can affect the environment. All right, you're thinking golf. How can golf affect the environment? Well, there's a real popularity of golf that's going to take off in the United States and basically the 20th century. And you can see that there's a huge need for golf courses. To make a golf course, it affects the environment tremendously. But because of pop culture and because of the great popularity of this great sport is spreading not just in the United States, but continues to spread all over the world, it does damage to the environment. All right, you have golf courses that, because the popularity increases worldwide, you have some golf courses that are 200 plus acres. All right, you have to really think about the damage done to the environment to build a golf course. Okay, so when we're talking about the environmental sustainability pillar here, or the environment pillar of sustainability, you got to think about the damage that is done. I have an image here of the golf course at Augusta where the Masters was played. You can see how there's a golf course in a desert in Africa, in Namibia, that looks the same way. All right, the damage that was done there to build that golf course is definitely a great example of how pop culture can damage the environment and definitely affect the environment adversely. Now, the opposite of cultural convergence is what we're going to finish with today, and it's a concept called cultural divergence. The tendency for culture to become dissimilar over time, okay? It's how two cultures, when they tend to meet, become more and more dissimilar over time, which obviously helps to continue the concepts of pop culture and folk culture and so on, okay? One great example of this is here in the United States, where we have people that live in urban areas and people that live in rural areas, okay? And this is kind of fun to talk about. So the rural areas, as you know, are dominated by farming and dominated by manufacturing. In urban areas, you have more money. Obviously, less farming, less manufacturing. It's dominated by migration. Urban areas in the United States have tons of ethnic groups, a little bit different than the rural areas. Now, one way that we can look at this, which is a great example, is TV shows. And you can see here that in 2017, here are the TV shows that were watched primarily in rural areas compared to urban areas and vice versa. I'm not sure how to read this chart because I live in an urban area, but if I'm looking at the TV shows in the list of rural area shows, I absolutely love The Deadliest Catch. I love NCIS. I absolutely love The Walking Dead. All right, it's one of my favorite shows. I love Wipeout. But I also love Game of Thrones. It's my favorite show of all time. I really, really enjoy The Simpsons. I enjoy The Tonight Show. I enjoy a bunch of those things on that list. So I'm very, very conflicted on Modern Family. I'm conflicted on this chart, but it definitely shows the differences in 2017 between the popular shows in rural areas compared to the popular shows in urban areas. Now, cultural differences, talking about at an interregional scale, interregional meaning in the same area, okay? We got to go back to chapter 1 to look at the vernacular areas where we look at similar differences with same history and same traditions. Now, a great example of cultural differences close in an interregional scale is the American South, all right? You can look at the American South that we looked at in chapter 1 as a great example, okay? This is a perfect example of a vernacular region that has cultural differences at an interregional scale. The South basically has this distinct area, and it has a bunch of factors that say this. So if you're looking closely at this chart and diagram, you can see that there's a bunch of different number of definitions according to the state in southeastern states, all right? This diagram shows you the amount of areas where the word y'all are used to address a group of people. You can see the dollar signs represent the state with the income below the national average. You can see how precipitation affects areas and farming and so on. You can see the majority of the people that are at least 50% Baptists on this. And you can see the temperatures, which definitely affect things here. So the American South is a great example. And then you can also think about all of the other cultural differences in these areas just off the top of your head for those of you that are familiar with the American South. All right. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about are cultural differences at an individual scale. And to do that, we're going to go to the United States Department of Labor Bureau of Labor Statistics that put out a survey, which is called the American Time Use Survey. And this is going to give you a great example of the patterns on an individual scale of people here in the United States and what their interests are by age. So the top pie chart, you can see the interest in people, the amount of time that people spend doing leisure things from the age of 20 to 24. The bottom right pie chart show you the age groups from the people of the age of 65 to 74. So just to give you a heads up, as far as people watching TV, watching television, you can see that there's a lot of people in the older ages that watch TV considered and compared to people of a younger age. And you can see that by looking at this pie chart, obviously older people like to read a lot more, and that's very obvious in class sometimes that older people like to read more than younger people. You can see the relaxing and the thinking. You can see as we go through with computer use, as we get into more technology with games and leisure, you can see that younger people obviously spend more time doing that. And the other numbers are very similar as far as other activities, as far as sports and exercise, and as far as socializing and communicating. This is a good idea and a good example of how you can look at cultural differences on an individual scale.